Chapter 2. Pat Stevens had to traverse the entire single block of Main Street from the village square to reach the Jewel Hotel at the other end. There weren't many saddle horses at the hit and rack along the way. Half a dozen of the old-timers had remained loyal to the Gold Eagle Saloon, and their horses were tied outside. But 9/10 of the other riders in town were congregated at the Jewel. A lopsided yellow moon faced Pat in the east as he walked along the boardwalk past the almost deserted business houses and restaurants. There was already the sharp tang of autumn in the night air in that portion of the southern part of Colorado that lay eastward from the Rockies, and Pat drew in great draughts of clean, cool air in an effort to clear the confusion from his mind as he walked forward. The night air didn't have the usual effect on his mind. He was a simple man, accustomed to simple solutions and direct answers. His way of meeting almost any emergency was by straightforward action. He felt now that he should have taken Fred Ralston by the throat back there in the lean-to and choked an explanation out of him. He didn't know quite why he had restrained himself from doing that. Instead, he had let Ralston go away thinking he had talked to Jethro Purdue. And by that action, he had invited the continuance of whatever sinister plot that Ralston, Dems, and Kitty Lane were involved in together. Looking at it that way, Pat realized he'd be responsible for anything that happened or might happen at the Jewel Hotel. He could have stopped it merely by letting Ralston know that Jeth Purdue had not yet assumed office. Instead of that, he had played smart and encouraged them to go on with their plan. Pat's lips twisted in a mirthless smile as he thought his way out. He was acting, by golly, like a smart city detective instead of a simple Western sheriff. Like he wanted something to happen so he could look smart by solving it the way detectives always did in those storybooks. His pace increased and he became more and more uneasy as he came close to the hotel. 25 or 30 horses were sitting outside, and bright lights and music streamed out of the swivel doors and wide plate glass windows of a large ground-level room beyond the entrance into the hotel lobby. Some of Pat Stevens' uneasiness evaporated as he shouldered the swinging doors aside and stepped into the saloon. The bar was crowded with laughing men, and half a dozen were grouped around the accordion and tinny piano at the end of the room, singing a popular song of the day in loud disharmony. Certainly, he thought, nothing very serious had happened here yet. It gave him sort of a foolish feeling to walk into this scene of gaiety and good fellowship when he had been fearing something else. He tipped his Stetson back on his head and hooked his thumbs into his gun belt and looked around for Fred Ralston or Kitty Lane. Neither of them were in the saloon or in the hotel. Neither did he see either Sam SLOAN or One-Eyed EZRA about. But as he stood in the doorway, Joe Dems detached himself from the group at the bar and came towards him with a hearty greeting.
Well, well, if it's not Patrick Stevens. Going to loosen up and celebrate now that you're rid of that badge, Pat?
Pat replied, I'm looking for Sam.
Well, he's probably around here somewhere.
Dems put his hand on Pat's arm and encouraged him towards the bar.
Here, have a drink on me, now that you're not sheriff anymore.
Pat Dems was about Pat's height, a deceptively slimness of figure that hid a lot of substantial weight. He was about 35 years, though his thinning sandy hair made him look older. His face and voice had a surface appearance of geniality, though it could not wholly hide the hardness of the man underneath. His forehead sloped back sharply from ragged eyebrows, and he had a sharp nose that had at one time been knocked awry. It had grown back almost straight, but enough one-sided to give his face a curious appearance of uneasiness. He had long, white hands in a way of gesturing nervously with them, and he wore a green striped shirt with red suspenders holding up tight-legged pants of black broadcloth and red elastic armbands on the sleeves of his shirt. Pat let himself be led to the bar by the proprietor and said quietly, "I'll buy my own drink, Dems, and I'll drink it alone." Dems let his arm go with a pained look.
Well, that's not very friendly, Stevens.
Pat replied, "I didn't mean it to be." He turned away from Dems and said curtly to the bartender, "Green Valley." Joe Dems stayed by his side. He cleared his throat as the bartender set out a shot glass and poured bonded bourbon over it.
"I thought the reason you'd be staying away from my place was because you was sheriff and felt you shouldn't be doing much drinking in public."
Pat downed his drink without saying anything. Dems laughed uncertainly.
"But I thought things would be different after you turned your badge over to Jeff Perdot."
Pat set his glass down and spun a half-single dollar over the counter. "You do a lot of thinking, don't you, Dems?" Then he turned and brushed past the proprietor to the side door that led into the small hotel lobby. There was a leather-covered sofa and 4 straight-backed chairs in the lobby. A wizened little man leaning on the counter over an open hotel register blinked rheumy eyes at the brightly lit saloon. He showed some yellow snags of teeth in a smile when Pat came through the doorway.
"First time I seed you around here, Pat."
"Evening, Farney." He came up to the counter, leaned one elbow upon it, looked down at the open registry when he got out the makings.
"I reckon you just couldn't make out to stay away no longer."
The aged clerk chuckled gleefully.
"That Kitty Lane brings 'em all in sooner or later, but you'll have to cut out Sammy SLOAN if you're going to get anywheres with Kitty."
His cackle of merit had an obscene sound. Leaning over the counter, Pat was reading the last name written on the register. In heavy, bold letters was written, F.A. Ralston, Denver, Colorado. The number of the room assigned to Ralston was scratched so thinly that Pat couldn't make it out. He put the blunt tip of his finger on the name and asked, "What room's he got?" Tom Forrest peered down at Pat's fingertip.
"That dude from Denver? Number 15. I recollect he asked for it particular."
"Is he in his room now?"
"Well, I reckon. He went up and I never seed him come back down."
"What room have Sam and Ezra got?"
"They got 2 rooms." The clerk chuckled happily. "Yes, sirree. 1 room for each of 'em, living in style since they sold out their ranch and moved into town."
"What's the room's number?" Pat asked sharply.
18 and 20. Right straight back from the head of the stairs. I don't know whether you'll find them there or not."
"I'll go see." When he turned away, he became aware that Joe Dems had come up silently behind him while he stood at the counter. The hotel proprietor had little brown eyes which looked yellowish now that it met Pat's. Dems stood between Pat and the foot of the stairwell leading up to the hotel rooms. He stood there with his arms folded and asked the clerk,
"What did Stevens want?" "He asked what rooms Ezra and Sam's was in."
Joe Dem's lips came back from his teeth.
"Didn't he ask you something else?" "Well, now that I recollect."
Pat took a step forward, eyes blazing. "Why don't you ask me, Dems?"
"All right, I will. What are you snooping around for?"
Pat Stevens drew in a deep breath. His hands were bunched up in big fists by his side, and he said, "I'm going up."
"No, you're not."
Dems stepped backwards up the second stair, the yellowish glint becoming more pronounced in his eyes. Pat controlled himself and asked, "Why not?" in the tone of a reasonable man who wanted an answer.
"Because I say you're not, and this is my hotel."
"It's a public place," Pat told him gently.
"Well, I own it."
Pat took a step forward, his voice remaining gentle, but it had a steely firmness. "You'll get hurt unless you get out of the way, Dems."
Dems snarled, "Not me."
He unrolled his arms and showed Pat a stubby double-barreled derringer in his right hand. It was no larger than a woman's fist, yet a lethal weapon as a large caliber. Dems warned in a thin voice.
"Don't force me to use this in protection of my property, Stevens."
Pat put one hand on the newly pole and grinned up at the proprietor. "That's a pretty funny way to treat a sheriff."
"You're forgetting you're not the sheriff any longer."
Pat slowly reached into his pocket of flannel shirt and drew out his silver sheriff badge. He showed it to Dems in the palm of his hand. "What's that look like?" Dems paled and bit his underlip.
"But I thought Jeff Perdot."
Pat shrugged and replaced the badge in his pocket. "Changing your mind about me going up?"
"No."
The derringer still threatened Pat.
"Sam and Ezra aren't in their rooms. If you'll wait in the bar room, I'll have them located for you."
Pat's lunging body drove forward and his left arm shot out to encircle Dem's legs. He straightened up swiftly and the proprietor's head went back, hitting a stair step loudly. His body went limp and the tiny pistol clattered down at Pat's feet. Pat tossed Dems aside on the floor, picked up the derringer, and said curtly over his shoulder, "Throw some water on him, Forley," and then went up the uncarpeted stairs 2 at a time. There was a wide hall at the top, with closed doors on each side. Pat walked down the hall and stopped in front of the door numbered 18. He knocked on it loudly, but got no response. He moved to the next door on the same side, number 20, and knocked on it with the same negative result. He tried both doors and found them securely locked. He swung about and went across the hall to number 15. He got no answer when he knocked on it either. He hesitated for a moment, his face grim and his eyes narrowing, glancing up and down the hall, but all the doors remained tightly closed. He turned the knob of number 15 and was surprised to have the door swing open. It was dark inside. He struck a match, went across to the washstand and put a fire to the wick of a kerosene lamp, and turned to survey the small hotel bedroom in the yellow light. A suitcase lay open on the bed, and Fred Ralston's straw hat lay beside it. The room showed no other signs of occupancy. Pat grunted his disgust and turned to blow the lamp out. In the darkness, his gaze was attracted by a thin slit of light showing along the base of the wall on the right. He stepped over to it, investigated, and found it was coming beneath a door leading into another room. He put his ear against the thin panel and listened, but could hear nothing from the adjoining room. A tentative rap on the door brought no response. Again, he tried the doorknob and felt it turned under his hand. He eased the door open with his right hand on the butt of his holstered gun. He saw a frilly bedspread, and there was a creamy lace curtain at the window of a lit room. A lady's dress was draped over the foot of the bed. Pat pulled the door open wide, waited apprehensively for a scream of fright that would tell him that it was occupied. Then he saw the man's body laying in the middle of the floor. The crumpled body of Fred Ralston laying face down with a bone-handle hunting knife sticking up between his shoulder blades. Pat hurried forward, dropped to his knees beside the corpse of a man from Denver. Ralston was dead, and Pat recognized the hunting knife that had been driven home deep into his back. He stared at the initials that were carved into the bone handle. S.S. It was Sam SLOAN's hunting knife. End of chapter 2.